And now we are ready for the third and last section of the morning.
We are entering the last hour of our symposium, and I'm just looking back at how impressive it's been. I really appreciate the speakers and the topics they've addressed, and it's meshed well. These three next topics are so important, and I'm really thrilled that we have the experts here to address them. Our next speaker is Dr. Barbara Klein. She is a professor of ophthalmology at the University of Wisconsin. She's been here for a number of decades. Her work, she is a glaucoma specialist, but her research is to study populations. So it's not a laboratory, it's a laboratory of people, most specifically Beaver Dam, a population that has been studied now for over decades for their eye health. But she's also done a lot of research throughout the state of Wisconsin, looking at eye problems and how they affect our communities. During the course of this research, now in recent times, the question of genetics has come up. It's very important to understand the genetics of us, the population, and of us as individuals. And Barbara Klein has done a lot of work looking at genetics in this population group. But today, she will specifically address the role of genetics in macular degeneration. So thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out in this gray and cold day to listen to us. I'm going to present some information, and I have slides, but the slides are really a crib sheet for me. And so if you prefer to close your eyes and listen, that's fine too. I need some help. Genetics is not my primary area of interest, but it's, as you all know, it's in the news a lot. And there are some very interesting things, but I'll try and bring it home to you because of the lack of or the real clinical relevance. So here we go. So if we talk about genetics, we're really talking about families or family similarities. And this is not news to you, but families share very many things. They share food preferences. There are those who like bagels and lox, and there are other families that prefer brats and sauerkraut. They often share a love of particular recreational activities, and so you've got families that are out there hiking and rock climbing and playing soccer, and then you get the other guys who'd rather curl up with a book. Families also often share jobs, or they work in the same professions or the same businesses as their parents and grandparents. And you may know about Woburn, Massachusetts, and possibly some things that are attendant upon these common exposures and common jobs. They also share habits. Smoking tends to run in families. Somebody's done a study to look at the genetics of smoking. It's probably not genetically determined, but it may be that some of the tendencies are. At any rate, alcohol habits may be shared as well. And of course, they often share living places, such as growing up in the suburbs or growing up on farms where you have multi-generations, or those people who grew up in the inner city. And then you have the big geographic differences, people who live near the equator versus those who live near the Arctic. Let's see, if I can figure this out, I'll make it go ahead since I need, okay, just which one? Okay, here we go. Family members also share certain traits when you look at them. They often have similar complexions, although not always, similar hair and skin color, similar height and weight. They often have a similar sense of humor, which is quite interesting. Even people who are reared apart, family members tend to laugh at the same jokes. They often share diseases, but family members, except for identical twins, are not identical. So there are, let's see, sorry, this is not exactly the slide I had intended, but at any rate, AMD is one of those diseases that tends to run in families, and about 15 to 20% of people who have AMD, AMD being age-related macular degeneration, have at least one first-degree relative who also has the condition. A first-degree relative is a sibling, that is a brother or sister, or a parent. Sometimes there are more people in a family. So how does inheritance work? I'm just going to describe one simple thing for one simple gene for a reason, and you don't have to remember it, but I want you to get the concept. So each cell in our body has 2 copies of any gene controlling a given trait, whatever it is. Susceptibility to something, sometimes it's an enzyme, you know, a little bit more sophisticated. But genes occur in 2 forms. That is, you may have a gene that's a dominant gene and one gene that's recessive. You don't see its presence very often. You can have, and each cell has a copy of the gene from mom and a copy of the gene from dad. So you'll have some families or some moms that have 2 of the dominant copies, some have 2 of the recessive copies, could be a mom or a dad, and some have one of each. But each parent only passes on one of the 2 in the pair to their child, and the other is made up by the other parent. Well, this is a simple diagram, and it just points out that you get 2 different alleles. Alleles are copies or forms of the gene, and you get you get 2 from mom and 2 from dad. So sometimes you get the same 2 copies or the same 2 types from each parent, and sometimes one parent has the dominant and one has the recessive that they pass on. Let's see if I can get this further. When you have parents that have one of each, mom has one of each, that is a big B and a little b, and the dad has a big B and a little b, then if they have 4 children, 2 of those children will also have the big B and the little b. They're called heterozygotes. They're not the same. That's what hetero means. About a quarter, or 1 of the 4 children, will have the big B and the little b, and another 1 child will have, let's see, 2 children will have the big and the little, 1 will have 2 copies of the dominant, and 1 will have 2 copies of the recessive. I'm going to move on along. So this sort of process occurs for each gene, but not all genes have the same effect on the disease outcome. So to give you an idea how complicated this can be, for many conditions or many traits, there are several different genes that will affect the actual outcome in a person. For age-related macular degeneration, because it was thought that this was a very complex disease, a very, very large study was done worldwide where 16,000 cases of people with advanced macular degeneration were studied, and about 17,000 people who didn't have this disease. And so they looked at the gene patterns in those with the disease and those without the disease. They found that there were at least 52 different sites that affected macular degeneration, and that occurred in 34 genes. Some genes are very big, and they have different patterns throughout the gene. So they found 52. Now, the complication is that some of these genes were associated with protection from AMD, and some appeared to be causal. So you're getting the picture, much as I showed you with just one gene variant, how complicated this can be. If you have 54 different genes, and you have only 2 forms, then you multiply the risks. It's extraordinarily complicated. And 16,000 people is probably not enough to actually work out the pattern. There are 2 genes that seem to have much more of an effect than others, and they're reasonably prevalent, or they occur fairly often in North America. One is a gene called complement factor H, and I only tell you that name if you see the initials somewhere, CFH. And it's ordinarily associated with infection and fighting off infection. The other one is called ARMS2, and that's another important gene. We don't know much about its other effects. And so people who have this CFH gene tend to be very worried. But as we talked about before, there are lots of things that affect the expression of genes. We talked about environmental factors of a whole variety of sorts. And we didn't speak too much about any one, but they all may play on one of the aspects of the genetic components as well. I'm showing a picture here that you don't need to take in. It's just to show you that this is a picture of a normal retina from an 85-year-old woman who never had a problem with her vision and never developed macular degeneration. But she had 2 copies of the bad high-risk gene. She was what they call homozygous, and one would say, based on that genetic pattern, that she was at high risk. But she lived a long life and saw many things in her 85 years. So in summary, known genetic factors explain a lot of the genetic risk. In other words, if your parent or one of your siblings has it, you're probably at higher risk of macular degeneration. But we know that many genes interact with each other and with the environment to determine which person will actually develop the disease. So high risk doesn't mean it's a death sentence or it's a sentence for AMD. It makes you nervous, there's no doubt about that. Because there are some people who have low genetic risk and will develop AMD, and then there are some that have high-risk genes and won't. Our position being from the accumulated evidence is that it's likely that a good eye exam, a regular good eye exam by an ophthalmologist, surely if you have any symptoms, is probably the way to go, because early stages of AMD may be detected, and then your doctor may suggest certain lifestyle changes or certain food patterns that you might want to undertake. But with respect to, is genetic testing useful? At the moment, I would say it may become a useful tool. But now, a number of different studies suggest that it's too early to know which tests will be most reliable. False positives and false negatives occur, and I think one's money and time is better spent seeing the ophthalmologist, and certainly coming right in if you have symptoms. But that's my take on the genetics of it. So thank you for putting up with me.
Thank you, Barbara. It is so relevant when we hear about genetic testing for many diseases. I think it's important to be informed about macular degeneration as well.